What's up everyone, Lily's here. Today I'm gonna use this line graph in IELTS 16 to show you how to make relevant and clear comparisons. So the first graph shows the percentage of households with electrical appliances. The second graph shows the number of hours of housework per week per household. I read the essays that students posted on my website, and one mistake a lot of them make is assuming that there is a causal relationship between the two graphs. They assume that more and more households own the electrical appliances, and as a result, they spend less time on housework. You shouldn't make that assumption. We can't tell from the graphs why households spend less time on housework. Perhaps people were working longer hours, so they had less time for housework. We just don't know. So when writing the overview paragraph, don't say something like, overall, ownership of all three appliances increased during this period. As a result, the amount of time spent on housework decreased. If you use linking words like as a result or therefore to link the two graphs, you will make an irrelevant comparison. Here, we should simply use something like at the same time or meanwhile. I'm not done with the overview yet. Normally, for line graphs, we only need to describe general trends in the overview. We just need to say what increased and what decreased. But the trends in this graph are quite simple. They are all going up. In this case, I think it's better to add another key feature of the graph to the overview. So apart from general trends, we could also say which category is the biggest. But as you can see, none is always the biggest category throughout the entire period. So this doesn't work. Don't worry. We could also point out which category had the biggest increase. Refrigerators did. So I will add the information with that of refrigerators having the greatest growth. This is a comparison. Compared with the other two electrical appliances, refrigerators had the biggest increase. Note how I used that to refer to the ownership. So when you refer to an uncountable noun, you use that. Ownership is uncountable, so that is used. However, if you want to refer to a countable noun, in most cases, one works better than that. For example, when reporting these two numbers, we can say that the system in Paris opened in 1900 and the one in Tokyo opened in 1927. System is countable, so we use one to refer to it. It isn't wrong to say that in Tokyo, but native speakers told me that it sounded very ugly. Now, the overview paragraph is done. Let's move on to details paragraphs. I'm going to have 3 details paragraphs. If you just have 2 details paragraphs, one describing the first graph and the other one describing the second graph, your first details paragraph will be relatively long compared with the second details paragraph. That's why it's better to have 3 details paragraphs. In details paragraph 1, I will describe these 2 lines. And in details paragraph 2, I will describe this one. It had the lowest number at the beginning, but then showed the greatest increase. So I think it deserves a separate paragraph. And of course, details paragraph 3 will be about the second line graph. Let's start with details paragraph 1. A key to making clear comparisons is simply not to make a ton of comparisons. In a line graph, the most important numbers are those at the beginning and the end of the period, and those numbers in between are less important. You need to be unafraid of letting go of less important data that will make your essay messy and too long. You may want to report when refrigerators overtook the other 2 appliances. I'm not saying this feature isn't important at all, but it is less important than the numbers at the beginning and the end of the period. I definitely don't want to make my essay super complicated. I have to make a choice, especially when there is a lot of data. And I choose not to report when refrigerators overtook the other 2 appliances. Now let's start with washing machines. Washing machines were the most common of the 3 electrical appliances in 1920, with ownership reaching 40% of households. This is a comparison with the other 2 appliances. The next tip I want to give you is not to mix these three lines together to report. For example, don't continue to write. In contrast, a third of households owned vacuum cleaners and almost no household owned refrigerators. If you do this, you will need to go back to washing machines and report their numbers in the following years. This is not only hard to report, but also hard to read. I think our essay will be much easier to read if we describe the three lines one by one. So I will continue to report washing machines. Let me show you something super cool. Instead of saying that their numbers then increased and then decreased and then increased again, we can simply say that their numbers kept increasing with only a small dip in 1980. This number then increased to about 75% by 2019, with only a small dip in 1980. This technique is very useful. Let me give you another example. So this graph shows the quantities of goods transported in the UK. A stupid way to describe this line is to say it remained stable, then increased, then remained stable, then decreased, and then increased. How about we simply say it increased with a dip in 1998? The volume of cargo transported by water showed a climb from about 40 to 65 million tons between 1974 and 2002, with a small dip in 1998. It also works for this line. So this line represents the number of visitors staying on the island. From here to here, you could say that the number remained unchanged, then decreased, and then increased. But it's more clever to say that the number remained unchanged with a small dip in 2016. Now, let's go back to this graph. We've just finished reporting washing machines. Next up, vacuum cleaners. I don't think there is anything special or interesting about them. Their numbers simply went up steadily, so I will just say so. Nearly a third of households owned vacuum cleaners in 1920. Although ownership climbed steadily, it didn't reach 100% until 2000. As I said, for a line graph, the numbers at the beginning and the end of the period are the most important numbers. That's why I reported these two numbers and omitted all the numbers in between. This paragraph is done. Now let's move on to details paragraph 2, in which I will report refrigerators. I explained earlier in the video, I'm not going to report when refrigerators overtook the other two appliances. I will instead focus on their sharp increase. In comparison, almost no households had a refrigerator in 1920. However, ownership increased rapidly, and by 1980, there was one in every household. Do you see how clear your sentences can be if you are willing to let go of some features? The first line graph is done. Notice how I used the word ownership to avoid repeating the percentage of households that own the washing machines, vacuum cleaners, or refrigerators. Now let's move on to the second graph. Remember, there is no causal relationship between the increase in appliance ownership and the decrease in the amount of time spent on housework. So don't use linking words like as a result. But we can contrast the increase with the decrease. So I will use in contrast to transition to this paragraph. The amount of time spent doing housework, in contrast, first fell significantly from 50 to 15 hours per week per household between 1920 and 1980. Next, I want to describe the trend from 1980 onwards. What transition word can we use? You could use afterward. Afterward, it experienced only a small decline to just over 10 hours a week in 2019. Or you could use from there. From there, it experienced only a small decline. Please don't use from here. You can use here if you are pointing at the graph, pointing at the year 1980. However, there's no graph on our answer sheet. This paragraph is also done. Now let's finish the introductory paragraph. In this paragraph, I will paraphrase the introductory text of the graphs. This won't be hard if you use the titles of the graph to paraphrase. For the first graph, I will just say this. The first graph displays the percentages of households in a country that own the electrical appliances between 1920 and 2019. Be careful, in a country should be here modifying households. Households in a country. Don't put it here. Now the second graph, note that the title says per week per household. This means that all the numbers in the graph are averages. They divided the totals by the number of weeks and the number of households. In this case, we can use the average household, while the second graph shows how much time the average household in that country spent doing housework every week during the same period. The average household and every week mean per household per week. The average is something is a lifesaver when it comes to paraphrasing. Here's another example. This bar chart shows average weekly spending by families. That is to say, the figures in this chart are averages. So we can say how the average family in one country spend their weekly income. The introductory paragraph is also done. Here's the entire essay. And here are 3 key takeaways. Do not make assumptions. Do not assume that there is a causal relationship between the two graphs. Secondly, do not make a ton of comparisons. You need to be unafraid of letting go of less important features that will make your essay messy and too long. Lastly, don't mix together all the lies. Instead, report them one by one. That's all for today. If you are interested in learning more about how to deal with data, make sure to check out these 2 videos. Thanks for watching. Bye!